Hi, I'm Gary Peterson from the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, and I'm going to talk today about the way different types of scenario approaches can be used to address different types of problems. The way I'm going to organize this talk is around the concept of the policy cycle, which is a simplified way of thinking about how problems are addressed. So this represents an idealized way of thinking about policy or problem-solving information, but it is useful because it identifies different phases in this process, even if the cycle doesn't actually occur. So this cycle argues that there is an agenda setting phase, which identifies what a problem is. This is obviously a political and social process, but it's a key phase in problem formalization. Once the problem is formalized or identified, then there's some efforts to identify alternate solutions and design an approach to address that specific problem. Once a particular approach is chosen, that has to be implemented, which requires translating it into action. After an approach is implemented, it can be evaluated to understand how it worked or didn't work, leading to a new type of problem identification, continuing the cycle. So this cycle is useful for thinking about scenarios, for as shown in this picture from the IPES methodological assessment of models and scenarios, different types of scenario processes can be related to the different phases of this policy cycle, in that different ways of doing scenarios help illuminate the issues that are in these different types of the policy cycle. I'm going to go through each of these in turn and talk about each of these different types of scenarios. Perhaps most widely used type of scenario planning is the production of exploratory scenarios. These scenarios ask what if something happens and look at how the world can unfold from today in different ways. This is useful for expanding the range of options that people are thinking about or what could happen, and be used to try and identify what a problem really is. So this is useful in this agenda setting phase. A less widely used, but quite useful type of scenarios can be target-seeking scenarios, which take a particular target and then think about alternate pathways to that target. This is sometimes called backcasting, of that you move backwards from a goal, but it's looking at what are the consequences of different ways to achieving a desired goal. Policy screening scenarios are also widely used, and these are often done using models to say, well, what would be the consequences of different types of policy? So if this agricultural policy is chosen versus that agricultural policy, what will be the consequences for farmers' livelihoods, for biodiversity, and water quality, for example? These are used in designing the implementation of a particular policy design. Less widely used, but arguably very much needed, are retrospective scenarios to say, well, given that something has happened, how do the outcomes from what has happened in the past compare to alternate things that we could have done? So rather than saying, what is the status of biodiversity or social equality, if we look back into the past and if we chose some other paths, what, based on our current understanding, do we think the world could have looked like? This can be useful to reveal failures or successes that maybe aren't immediately obvious, to help think about how to evaluate something that has been done in the past. There are many examples of each of these different types of scenarios, and I've picked 4 examples to try and give a bit more detail that I'm aware of. So a well-known example of exploratory scenarios is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment's global scenarios, which looked at how the world can unfold in a relatively positive way based on different dominant approaches to managing ecosystems. It's looked at 4 different approaches and looked at the relative strengths and weaknesses of a world produced for these different approaches. Target seeking scenarios are yet less widely used, but they are used. An example of this is work my colleagues and I have done in Sweden, looking at what are alternate pathways for Sweden achieving its food system, climate, biodiversity, and health goals, and who would be winners and losers, what would be possibly unintended consequences of these different types of pathways. So in these scenarios, we're looking at, say, 2050, the outcomes for climate, health, and biodiversity would all be very similar, but the food system would look quite different. Policy screening scenarios are doing things the opposite way. They're saying, well, we're here today. What would be the consequences for different policies? A nice example of this has been done in the Bahamas, where the Natural Capital Project worked extensively with local government officials to develop iteratively a set of scenarios that looked at the consequences of different policies that were being considered for people, economy, and nature, to evaluate which one of these scenarios would potentially be the best for the Bahamas. There are not so many examples of retrospective scenario analysis, but they exist. And one example is looking at the effects of forest policy in Chile. So comparing what actually happened to what could have happened with different types of forest policy. So this is giving a broad overview of different types of scenario planning and how it connects to different types of policy contexts or decision contexts. And a key point here is, of course, the real world is more complex. There's more than one problem, and policy processes don't work in such a simple way. What this means is that actually often real world scenario planning processes combine different elements of these idealized types, and that can be very useful. A key point to successful work in scenario planning with people outside the academy is to make sure that the methods being used fit the people and the problem that are being addressed. Furthermore, one of the points that's doesn't come clear of thinking just about the policy cycle, but a widely used reason for doing scenario planning is that it provides an accessible way for different types of knowledge and people to come together. It can be used to mobilize knowledge that isn't available in scientific papers. It can be used to translate knowledge between different scientific or practitioner knowledge systems. And it can be used to connect knowledge to tell a cohesive story that's understandable. This is one of the reasons why scenarios are widely used in global or regional environmental assessments, for this integrative effect rather than a problem-solving reason. This is important to consider that as well. And then finally, as I already kind of hinted at, it's often that scenario quality can often be improved by iteration or doing multiple things rather than doing one thing more in depth. And I think that's also useful to think about with this kind of policy cycle framing, that if you want to advance things, it's often maybe good to do things a little bit quickly to home in on what actually is the essential problem, rather than trying to do deeply address something that maybe isn't so well conceived in the first part. But of course, doing things many times requires more effort, time, and resources. So in conclusion, main point here is there's different types of scenario planning that can be used to address different problem types. You can combine these together to address scenarios or problems you can combine scenario approaches together to address complex problems in a useful way, and that how you do this should fit in your particular context. There are a bunch of resources in the slides that accompany this talk that give the references that I've mentioned and provide some links to further examples.